Hello, everyone. Good morning and welcome to day 2 of the Bangalore Literature Festival 2020. My name is Mohan and I will be your host for today. Yesterday, we had a great lineup of speakers and a fantastic agenda. So for those of you who joined us yesterday, thank you. And for those of you who are joining us and coming back from yesterday, we welcome all of you. Thank you for joining us in person or virtually. This time, of course, because of the situations around us, we are having a hybrid event. Some of us have gathered here at the Bangalore International Center, taking into consideration all safety precautions. And for those of you who can't join us, we're live streaming all of our sessions today. So thank you for joining us either way. For those of you who gathered here, please ensure you're masked at all times, including your noses, and you're taking all safety precautions. Thank you. With that, we are ready to get started with our first session on day 2 of the Bangalore Literature Festival. We have 2 parallel sessions happening, one at the auditorium and the hall. And today in our hall here, our first session is a conversation about Avasthe. We have Chandan Gowda, Deepa Ganesh, and Manu Chakravarthy in conversation with Indira Chandrasekhar. First published in Kannada in 1978, Avasthe is U.R. Ananthamurthy's tour de force. In a nation struggling with corruption and the corrosion of human values, the Prime Minister is all set to become a ruthless dictator. From his sick bed, Krishnappa Gowda, revolutionary leader of the peasants, grapples with his conscience, the schemes of party men, and flattery from hangers-on. Memories come and go as his mind, tethered to a failing body, reaches for the true meaning of life. In Ananthamurthy's hands, life's cruel negations, caste, poverty, pettiness are delicately balanced with its triumphs, the splendor of nature, the majesty of poetry, the delight of friendship, the deliverance of love. And this discussion is about the recently published English translation. And with that, over to you, Indira. And very quickly, if there are questions, please feel free to use the Q&A section on Zoom. And for those of you who have gathered here, if you have questions, please feel free to come over here. You can use this mic to pose your question to the panel. With that, over to you, Indira.
Thank you. Thank you, Mohan. Am I audible, visible, etc., etc.? Everything all right? Yeah. Okay. So I'm holding up this wonderful book, Avasthe. Good morning. Welcome, I think, to surely what's one of the most important literary events of the season, which is the release, the revelation, one might say, and the first public discussion around this new translation by Dr. Narayan Hegde of U.R. Ananthamurthy's critically important novel, Avasthe. I'm very grateful that Professor Ananthamurthy's family are here, represented by Anuradha and Vivek, and my greetings to all of them and those who are not here as well. I'm honored indeed to be moderating the panel with these fine people. Chandan, Deepa, and Manu, each of whom has had a long and meaningful connection with Ananthamurthy and his work in different ways. I'm, in fact, the novice entrant into the fold, and yet here I am. And what this brings attention to, in my view, is that Ananthamurthy was one of those towering intellectuals who was also profoundly generous with his time, his thoughts, and his work. And apart from his own personal graciousness, it was, I believe, a conscious generosity in his chosen position as a public intellectual and a literary mentor. So I too have had the privilege of receiving Professor Ananthamurthy's grace, and at Out of Print, we are eternally grateful for that grace and generosity. We've featured a short story and a novella and an excerpt, the first 2 translated by Deepa and the last by Chandan. So before I go to the panel, the way we'll do it is I'll speak for a few minutes and just briefly talk about Dr. Ananthamurthy as well as about the book, very briefly. And then we will have the panelists who will each talk for a bit, and we'll discuss and then open up to the audience. I do have to say that we have a surprise at the end, which is that the translator, Dr. Narayan Hegde, will in principle be able to come on and participate in the session through audio. And hopefully all our technicals will work out, and we're very excited about that. So thank you, Vivek, for that alert. So before I get into the book, I would like to say a little bit about Dr. Ananthamurthy and about his intellectual and public persona. Surely my words will be inadequate, I think, to cover who he was and what he meant to the literary world. So let me just read out a little bit first from the HarperCollins blurb that says that Ananthamurthy is one of India's greatest literary figures and public intellectuals. And the cover carries a comment from the New York Times that says, "A literary colossus." In the outer print biographical note, which is also very brief, we draw attention to his important place in the literary trajectory of Kannada and indeed in subcontinental literature. Ananthamurthy's works span novels, incredible, powerful investigatory novels that unpeel really society, politics, caste, and individual response. These incredible novels, short stories that are complex, that are really, really profound, and yet extremely intimate, actually, which is the fascinating thing about them. Novellas, poetry, essays, I mean, the list is long. He wrote about everything. But also, it's important to recognize that in addition to his sharp, and may one use the word exploratory writing, it is important to emphasize that his social and political conscience was extremely honed and engaged, and he consciously chose to use his gift of words and thought and analysis to address in the public sphere critical political and social concerns, often controversial. And he engaged with these concerns, both in Kannada and in English, till the end. He won the Padma Bhushan and the Gyanpith Award, but was also very importantly, is remembered with tremendous regard by his peers and students and by the literary world. I will continue for a few minutes more just to say that in order to truly convey a deeper sense of the man and his writing, I would like to quote from 3 pieces written after his passing. K. Sachidanandan, the eminent poet and editor, said, "Some writers are celebrated not only as great masters of the word, literary personalities, but also as public intellectuals whose impact is felt across language, culture, education, and politics. You, Ananthamurthy, belong to that latter rare tribe of luminaries." Tim Parks, one of the judges of the Man Booker 2013, draws attention to Ananthamurthy's psychological penetration, his simultaneous awareness of the weight of cultural tradition and the individual's reaction to it. Shiv Vishwanathan, whose obituary on Ananthamurthy in the Hindu is perhaps the most personal, says, "UR was a custodian of memories, a trustee of the Brahmanic sensorium and its memories, and also its most scathing critic." Shiv also says, "I felt completely broken when UR Ananthamurthy passed away. It was as if a cosmos had collapsed, a way of life had disappeared. It was not the achievements of the man as a writer and a public intellectual, but the man himself as an achievement that mattered." To Avasthe, which is the first novel Arvind Adiga says that he ever read. Maybe presume he read it in Kannada, I don't know. Or did he read the earlier translation by Shantinath Desai? We will have to ask Arvind Adiga, I have no idea. But we have a cast of experts to speak about the novel, to focus on it. And we will engage with each of them in turn and then allow for some free responses among the panelists before opening to the audience. But before I give you the panel, if you'll indulge me for a few more minutes, or a few minutes, seconds really, I just want to say that when I read this novel, now here in translation, what a novel it is. I'm coming to it afresh, not comparing it to the original in Kannada, not looking at it with the weight of who Ananthamurthy is, what the novel means in the firmament of Indian writing. I simply read the novel and was excited and moved and just completely emotionally engaged with the sort of the tragedy and the politics of it. It's an extraordinary novel. As I was talking to Vivek, and I must acknowledge Vivek Shanbag, big thank you for the warmth and openness with which he shared his time and energy and thought around Ananthamurthy, around this novel, around writing, around Kannada literature. I'm grateful. As I was talking to him, he used a phrase that I'm going to sort of paraphrase and repeat. And the point that he made is, or we made together, but the phrase that he used, this is a political novel that examines, and I quote, the ethical and moral turmoil of a man. I close the quotes. A turmoil that a man with tremendous self-awareness and a sort of brutal integrity in that awareness views himself. The tragedy is that in the many compromises he makes and recognizes he's making and watches himself and watches the deterioration of his soul, we follow this novel and follow this man. And that is the extraordinary part, I think, of this novel. I'm going to close by quoting the last lines from Prayag Akbar's Afterword, which appears in the book. Ananthamurthy seems to suggest something else about memory here. In our final reckoning, the mind does not revert to victory. When we each think back on our lives, this novel tells us we will recall how we have loved and how we have failed. So thank you, panelists, whose expertise is clearly so much deeper, for your patience while I talked a little bit about the novel. And I think I'll begin with you, Chandan. And again, I'd like to really thank you for the conversations around the book before we started even sort of planning what we would talk about. And there are so many things that came up. I mean, there are so many things that came up. Partly, I have to say also, you as a translator of Ananthamurthy, you who have conducted these extraordinary intimate interviews with him. Also, a small and important note, Chandan is probably the only actor among us who's acted in a TV serial of Bharatipura, which is Ananthamurthy's other great novel, serialization as the main character, Jagannatha. And so when we were
directed a film on Avasthe.
On Avasthe, yes, additional trivia, yes important. So I was really trying to think about how we should focus and address all of the many things we talked about. And one of the things that really came up was the fact that the ideology in the political space these days, how is that addressed in literature, you know? And in a way, that is what this novel really examines as well, sort of the ideological trajectory of the hero, Krishna Pagoda. So would you like to talk a little bit about that and address that issue?
Thank you, Indira, for those very lovely opening comments. This novel is many layered. You can come at it from different vantage points, one of which is how is the question of political ideology being dealt with, if you want to use an instrumentalist term, like dealt. We've already seen in Bharatipura, even glimpses of it in Samskara, a suspicion of prepared thought as something that you can rely on to understand what's evolving in the present. So here too, Krishna Pagoda, who is persuaded by socialism, but we see clearly from his early youth, has remained somewhat skeptical of any hardened formulas for how politics is to be thought about. So people, even his mentors, whom he regards highly, there's a person called Naji, who is a communist, who has, like a Trotskyist. Each time he comes up with some sense for a grand idea of history, you have Krishna Pagoda remaining skeptical. And at the cost of humanism, he said ideology can come at the expense of humanism. There's a great moment where they're having a conversation in a small tea shop, and there's a boy who comes by selling groundnuts, and they're in the middle of this heavy theoretical conversation, and Nabi asks him to get away from them. And that, I think, is a way of signaling to how your obsession with a certain formulaic understanding, or formula for understanding things can make you deeply insensitive. And listening to Annaji's own prescriptions for how political activism has to be done. There's an instrumentality to it that Krishna Pagoda, does not accept. He keeps thinking of the means and relationship. And importantly, he keeps saying, he's always planning something secretively. He's conspiring, let's do this behind the scenes. And he just doesn't like politics that thinks it's normal to clandestinely plan action. So everything should be open. And then there are these other things about, an extraordinary aliveness to the body. So many times, in the middle of activism, you have activists suddenly becoming sensitive to the bodily attractions of those around them. And also in another sense, when he looks back to see how he himself, out of a certain reserve, had not actually had as many women friends as he may have had.
Yes.
So there are these regrets that in attention to the external world might have come at the expense of an inward looking, including the bodily desire. There's one more thing, Indira, before there's a nice quote here. He's, if Marxism is a philosophy of totality, it has everything figured out. There's a sentence that's against this. I quote, his indignation, his means Annaji's. Indignation, this is Krishna Bhagavan referring to himself. His indignation against the system, which he exuded like sweat from his body, lost its severity and meanness and developed into a perspective capable of handling things in their totality. So it's a limitation. That if you're able to see everything in the totality, then you're missing out on something. And what this is, just one more thing, Indra, is, throughout the novel, you'll find enormous attention being given to subtle shifts in conversations and how that positions the two people in conversation. You're being admired by someone for being honest, and then at the very next minute, you loathe the fact that you admired yourself for having been regarded as honest. And there are dozens of such cases. And so this is, I think, Ananthamurthy's way of somehow bringing us back to the micro level, away from the structural levels of political discussions, and seeing that human relations have to be closely attended to. And this also has to do with a sense of wholeness, but I suppose we'll talk about it later.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think, yes, that brutality with which he views himself is something that really comes through. It's a clear lens, right? Krishna Bhagava's clear lens. Well, before I ask the others to respond to what you just said, I just also wanted to, one of the comments, one of the things we realize is the importance of, caste doesn't play as forefronted a role perhaps as in Samskara or as in Bharatipura, but caste is an underlying aspect of this novel. So, I mean, would you like to comment on the fact that the hero in this novel, unlike in the others, is really from a lower caste, or Shudra?
I think it makes a very big difference to how the people are focused on this novel as a political novel, but I think this is very, very special thing. The narrative being Shudra / Vokkaliga. So how does Ananthamurthy view caste relations via his own relation with those around him? We see very early on that he's evolved. He is confident. There are Brahmins around him who clearly distance themselves from him, but that doesn't matter to him at all. In fact, he's very affectionate towards him, he's loving. His teacher, Joysa, and his wife, whom he calls Dodama, which is a king term. It's a family king term. She's, she doesn't touch him while she gives him eatables, etc. But that hasn't dimmed his love for them, because he knows that they've loved him and they wished well for him.
Yes, there's in fact tremendous affection in that.
And at the same time, it's not as if things are completely fine. And there's the part where I remember this distinctly, where the farmer satyagraha has taken off, and he's asked, Krishna Pagoda has asked people in the village to protest when the head of the mata comes to collect the tax.
That's right.
You dip your brooms in cow dung and smear him. And he does that. And the teacher doesn't approve of this action. And he keeps defending it. And the teacher says he may be a rotten person, but still did you have to do that?
Yeah.
And Krishna Pagoda keeps calling him in the singular,
Yeah.
the Mata tax official.
That's right.
He says he didn't like it because even if he was a bad Brahmin, he was nevertheless a Brahmin, which means he's enjoying the good from his past to deed. So there's a question mark.
Yeah.
So could this be crossed? And there's that thing that exists, but that doesn't come in the way of caste intimacy. And you find a lot of this. And there is the Shudra politics is placed out in other ways, very, very important ways. At some level, Krishna Pagoda says, if not for this person who helps him get educated, I would have remained a cowherd.
Yes, that's right.
And then there's also, his own modernizing impulse in him. He tells, as long as you believe in this folk deity Kalkutka, the temple will continue to exploit you. So give up your belief.
Exactly. Yes,
So
that is important.
there's that in him, and there are these asides. Must alert the audience which require extended attention. There's one aside where Krishna Pagoda wants to be a writer, and he knows he can't be a good writer. He's struggling. There's an example, and the first sentence he writes to show us how bad he is as a writer is about an untouchable who is carrying a basket of shit.
Yes.
And he says it's a bad sentence, and then he says, to be able to write about them, you either have to have experienced it or have a gift for words to convey authenticity. This sentence is doing a lot in terms of who is representation only limited to those being represented.
Yes.
I think there's a lot at stake there. And just one quick thing before the others also speak. There are some reversal of images. If you thought Brahmins were dominant, the teacher, Joysa, reminds him, look, I'm in this village because all the well-to-do dominant castes need astrologers. So reminding them that, I'm not exactly the one calling the shots here. There's a dependence of a pragmatic kind here, which is important. And Krishnapa's complete absence of any hostility towards upper castes is something very, very important to note. Even as he notices all this, he's not angry about
Yes.
He, in fact, his closest person is dictating his memoirs to Nagesha is a poor Brahmin who is his disciple because he believes in equality. So there's a way in which he's trying.
He's fighting the system, but not an individual animosity in a way, That
The systemic, there's just one last thing, there's a discussion where someone is saying that these Brahmins are horrible at the politicking.
Yes.
And Krishna Pagoda says, well, you don't know what the non-Brahmins are capable of.
Exactly.
So that's a way in which he's trying to sort of not indict an entire community.
Yes.
And in fact, it's a very, but at the same time, one very quick thing, I'm sorry, there's no Shudra life world. I mean, he's a Shudra character, but you don't get a sense of the Shudra life world in the novel. And interestingly, his speech pattern, Krishnapa's speech, is not Shudra speech. In the sense marked as, there's no attempt being made to make him speak like a Gowda from that region. It's, of course, you can't catch it in the translation, but it's not very original either. So that is something like.
That is a very interesting point, actually. I didn't note that. Somebody is keeping tabs of time, I hope. Huh? Yeah. Maybe we'll move to you, Deepa, so that everybody has enough time to comment, because I'm sure the others have a lot of responses to what you've said, but let's just go along. Thank you again. Our preparatory conversations were so rich and so open. Deepa, I know that you were engaged a great deal with Dr. Anandamurthy's in translating his work and have known him for many, many years. You worked closely with him even on Avasthe, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about that. And also what could be interesting is what you learned about his process as a writer, as an artist, through your conversations with him.
Indra, I'll have to look away from you because
Yes.
the mic is placed on my right.
No problem.
So there are many parts to the question.
Yes.
So let me answer whatever
Yes.
I
Yes.
can.
So turn away, don't worry, so that you're audible. Yeah.
Or should I move it this way? So, Avasthe is a political novel, or so it is categorized, and I would like to say it's an easy categorization. Set in post-independent India, post-emergency, the political climate of that time forms a very important aspect of the novel. The novel therefore discusses various shades of politics, ideology driven to opportunistic politics. And there's also a confrontation of Gandhi, Marx, and Lohia, who were abiding forces in URA, both as a writer and as an individual. The novel, therefore, is a product of its times. It's also an extension of the writer's preoccupations and his chief concerns. And as K.V. Subarna rightly points out in his essay on, he calls Avasthe part of the trilogy of Samskara Bharatipura and Avasthe, or he says it's one part of the three parts, one of the parts of three parts of one book. That's what he says. And Avasthe and the trilogy actually captures the life of independent India. He maps the 30 years in his three novels. So is Avasthe a political novel? Yes, it is. But is it merely a political novel? No, it's not. Avasthe transcends its own canvas and intensely examines the contradictory forces, the paradoxes, such as old, new, tradition, modernity, antaranga, bahiranga, social, personal, love, lust, etc., etc., the subliminal and the violent, and as it maps out in the life of individuals. So during the course of the novel, these dichotomies dissolve, they separate, they merge, and URA writes a story of very complex textures. Like other writers of his time, for example, Tejasvi, Girish Karnad, A.K. Ramanujan, Lankesh, in a sense, there is an invocation of the modernist sense of alienation and fragmentation. You see it till the very end. He says that there's a line by Krishnappa towards the end of the novel. He says, "Navu idiyagi badkode illa gauri." So the sense of alienation and fragmentation runs throughout. And just as there is a desire for commitment and social change. Anantmurthy never resolves anything in this novel. And even if there are answers, they are tentative. The other very important thing about Avasthe is that Avasthe was eventually made into a film. After the novel was made into a film, and it attracted a defamation suit, and it said that it borrows heavily from the life of Gopal Gowda. And Anantmurthy writes an essay in one of his essay collections, and it's called Avasthe Kuritu, and it's a compilation of 3 press releases that he released after the defamation was filed. And in that he says, if the novel was to masquerade Gopal Gowda's life, then why would I write a novel? I could have written a biography itself. Anantmurthy says that. However, he doesn't deny that people and incidents to whom he was close to has influenced the novel. For instance, he says there are resonances from the life of J.H. Patel, from Gopal Gowda, and from J.P. In fact, he says that the Hindi translation of Avasthe attracted a lot of attention because socialists up north identified JP with Krishnappa Gowda. In fact, in one of Manu's interviews with URA, he draws attention to one Kailasapati. And he says that Kailasapati apparently during a conversation with Anantmurthy tells him that individuals don't matter in the course of history, but it's only political and economic forces. And Nagaraj actually says that line in Avasthe. And in fact, another critic, C.N. Ramchandran, sees Devraj as Krishna Pagoda. So many people see many things in the character of Krishna Pagoda, but what Anantmurthy pertinently says is that he says his creative writer's work transforms real life incidents into a work of art. For instance, if someone wrote the biography of Macbeth, we would have read it as the story of an overambitious king and a murderer. But when Shakespeare transformed it into a work of art, we identify it with the pain and agony and anguish of Macbeth, and we become a part of it. So, what he's actually drawing attention to is the tradition of contemplation in Indian aesthetics, which is called Sadharanikarana, and that's what Anantmurthy does with his work. Avasthe therefore keeps the larger political narrative in the background and foregrounds the life of Krishna. And it's also not chronological. He breaks chronology deliberately because he doesn't want us to read it as biography. And journeys, as Anantmurthy recognizes wonderfully in this novel, are not just forward movements. They are return to one's past, and you rediscover the past with new meanings and with new meanings rather. And journeys are always not external; they are also internal. Anantmurthy captures these many movements in the novel, and he moves towards constructing the central metaphor which resonates in the title. Avasthe is not just the state of politics as it was when he wrote the novel. Avasthe is also a state of mind, and it's not just a single state of mind. He yokes together many states of mind, something that's spontaneous, natural, something that's ideological, and something that's political. He yokes together many states of mind and creates a very complex narrative in Avasthe. So it's actually an intellectual quest into these several states that exist between personal, political, and the spiritual.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that extraordinary encapsulation of the novel. I did have one question also, though, and I'll begin that by just reading. You referred to it a little bit about the idea of the body. And I found it, I mean, I think both of us resisted the idea that the woman on the panel should talk about the relationship of the character with women. However, I was, since we had talked about it, it does seem appropriate. You know, one of the main female characters in the book, whom the protagonist, the love really.
Indira, just to interrupt, you should Manu talk and then I come back to me about.
All right. Well, if you would prefer to do that, yes, why not? Maybe it would be a more natural flow also of contextualization. All right. Thank you. And
maybe running out of time.
yes, I'm
How
not
much
sure.
time do you have?
I don't know. Our timekeeper drifted away, so we will find out. Yeah. 10:40 now. Okay. 10:49. All right. Okay. So, yes, but however, since you suggested it, I think it does make sense. I think, you know, and also because Manu, I appreciate very much your comment in our preparatory discussions when you said we don't have enough time to talk about this book and we don't have time enough to talk about the context of this novel. But I think a little bit is better than nothing at all. So I appreciate very much your coming in and talking to us about your. Well, firstly, I think you have had the longest relationship among all of us with Anantmurthy. You knew him from post-PUC, is that correct? And of course, you've translated a tremendous number of his works, the non-fiction. You've been involved in the short stories. You've interviewed him. You've been part of his engagement, critical analysis, in essays. I mean, you really have engaged with his work and his person. And so it's really very important that you are here with us today. I think what might be interesting, especially following Deepa's allusion to the context in which the novel was written, it might be very important maybe for you to speak about the first response, that how this novel was first received when it was published in Canada in 1978.
Thank you, Indira. In fact, let me begin with Avasthe in the making.
Yes.
Not Avasthe, the finished work. Because it was in 78 that he started writing the novel. And we had 8 to 9 sessions, reading sessions, followed by discussion, and Avasthe was being crafted, recrafted. So quite a few of us were into the making of Avasthe.
Oh, exciting.
And the first ever discussion on Avasthe was between my teacher and me over the All India radio. It was a discussion that helped him understand, as he said, the novel better.
In English?
In English. Now, I want to turn to Avasthe through Samskara and Bhartipura. Because I think Avasthe also presented Ananthamurthy with a very deep creative crisis. And not just the external political historical crisis. See, Samskara and Bhartipura, grama, village, tradition, culture, an organic location. Not very difficult, and characters who had a sense of being. Praneshacharya as the Maha Acharya, an integral self. And Jagannatha as the Zamindar, upper caste, West educated, liberal. So it was quite easy for Ananthamurthy to come to terms with people who had an integral self and in a cohesive society, two cohesive societies. Because even Bhartipura is just a small town, whereas Praneshacharya is in the Agrahara. So the location gave him a sharp edge, dealing with characters who had a given self, different selves, but there was something organically united, cohesive. So the first two novels were actually stories of disowning all that, of transgression, of disinheriting. Praneshacharya, his authority as the Vedanta Shiromani, it happens in the novel. And for Jagannatha to disown all his class caste positions. So I think given the state of being of two characters and to deal with them in a creative manner because of the organic location was not much of a creative challenge for Ananthamurthy. It's in Avasthe that you enter a very fragmented area, split, fissured, impersonal, depersonalized. And that's why you see the important point that Chandan made about not having the Vokkaliga, the Shudra locale, is also because you cannot push Krishna Gowda into the Vokkaliga domain. He's already away from it, moved out of it, and he is poor economically. So how do you deal with a character who, in a very philosophical sense, is deracinated, has an impersonal self, moves into the larger spaces, impersonal metropolitan spaces, and confronting contradictory forces, divisive forces, each one taking something away. So I think that was a very, very major creative challenge for a very perceptive, thinking writer like Ananthamurthy. These were also ideological questions. So he was dealing with something solid in the first two novels, but dealing with an amorphous locale and a character who understood that there was something amorphous to his own self. And also, you see, how do you deal with politically? The modern nation state, impersonal, and the emergency had taken place. 1978, also 1 year after the formation of the Janata government under Morarji Desai, the collapse of the parliamentary system, too many divisions taking place, and it was a major personal intellectual crisis for Ananthamurthy that what he believed in had collapsed. You see, three layers are the Gandhian values, which he cherished so much, erasure of the Gandhian values. Second is, this is very important, very central, that the socialists were behaving like monkeys. In fact, initially with Charan Singh and Raj Narayan. In fact, they're doing everything because it was Charan Singh who raised the question of dual membership. Because the Jan Sangh had been dissolved, Vajpayee, Advani, others came into all these. You find rich resonances in the novel, all the manipulations. So is it political? It's political. Is it creative? It is creative. It's also a metaphysical crisis for somebody like Krishnappa Gowda, believing in the socialist order. It's a challenge for deep socialists. And then you also begin to notice that socialism is collapsing, that the socialists are behaving like loons. Just one anecdote. When Morarji Desai returned from one of his foreign trips, Raj Narayan gave him a bouquet of flowers saying, "Bahut khushbu hai." And then Morarji Desai said, "Magar jo aap kar rahe hain, badbu hai." So this was also the disintegration of the social. So what does a writer do? Now, I think these are the resonances of Avasthe. That Gandhian, you can't say that there is a Gandhian trajectory to this nation. No, the socialists are behaving like that. And later on, you see it because of Madhulimaye, George Fernandez, Anandmurthy kept saying, "We socialists." He never said they socialists. That was the inclusiveness. We have given birth to these fascist right-wing communal forces. And of course, the Morarji Desai government fell in 1979. But what's very important for me, and Chandan referred to it, you see, when you turn to a story like Akasha Mattu Bekku, The Cat and the Sky, or later stories, even say 2010, almost 40 years after Avasthe, Yettanindetta, Pache Resort. And if you turn to other stories, the Naxalite is a central figure. And here is one of the central figures, Annaji. And let me draw attention to this line that Krishnappa Gowda makes. Very serious. Annaji is the only visionary I have met in my life. Strongly embedded in the centers of the novel. This was also, you see, Anantmurthy trying to come to terms with, as a middle class, member of the middle class, as a bourgeoisie, that the Naxalite has to be taken seriously because he is the one who is going to shake us out of our states of complacency, believing in parliamentary democracy. But what kind of a Naxalite is he? You see, in one section of the book, it is Annaji, very surprising, very important, a self-reflexive Naxalite. And as an aside, I will tell you that my teacher and I had several conversations with Naxalite activists. So the birth of urban Naxalism began there itself. But so the point is, it's Annaji who says, because Anandmurthy was mulling over these things, he says, Lenin also failed. And that's the whole story of Lenin, Stalin, and of course, Khrushchev denouncing Stalin at the plenary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. But it is an acknowledgement of the fact that the middle class cannot take to very comfortable positions, talking of socialism, of Gandhianism. So Annaji is situated as a very, very important self-reflective, the degree of self-reflexivity in Annaji you don't find in the other works. And therefore you will see, I will just take 1 minute and complete it. So he's dealing with several avasthes. And as Chandan and Deepa have pointed out, it's not a single state. So is it political? It's political. Is it metaphysical? It's metaphysical. Is it part of contemporary politics? Then it's part of contemporary. And here is a writer trying to come to terms with all these without really taking up very comfortable positions. So you can only deal with the multiple visions of the text. And if caste figures, but it's incidental because the OBC movement, and that was also the phase when Lalu Prasad Yadav, Mulayam Singh rose as very important youth leaders. And therefore, you will have to look at the multiple layers with which, and one of the few writers in India, English and all the other Indian languages put together, was able to deal with all these things without simplistic reductionisms working.
Extraordinary. Yes, thank you for that. Thank you for that. Yeah, really.
I would request you to wrap it up here.